The panelists are Angela Fernandez, Dr. Andrew Fenton, and Vaughan Black. I am Bianca Delbois, and I am with the Animal Alliance of Canada. Kira will be co-presenting with me, and Kira, I will let you introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, I'm Kira Berkeley. I'm the Advocacy Manager at Animal Alliance of Canada, and also a lawyer at Animal Environmental Legal Advocacy.
Wonderful. And just a little background on our panelists that are with us today, just before we go to our agenda and today's discussion. Angela Fernandez is a professor of law and history at the University of Toronto, and she directs the new animal law program as well. She oversees the Brooks Animal Law Digest and has spoken widely on the use of dogs and cats in medical research in Ontario. And Angela is also a visiting fellow with the Cambridge Center for Animal Rights Law. And I believe you're in the UK today, Angela. Andrew Fenton is a professor of philosophy at Dalhousie, and he specializes in animal ethics and the philosophy of animal cognition. His research examines what non-human animals can know, feel, and experience, and how those capacities should inform ethical standards and policy in science and research. Andrew is a wealth of knowledge and has been incredible throughout our process with everything that we've been doing in the No Pets and Research campaign. So thank you, Andrew. Vaughan Black is a retired law professor who taught at Dalhousie University for 35 years. Vaughan has extensive experience in animal-related law, legal aid, and research oversight. He served for many, many years on Dalhousie's university committee on the laboratory animals, which oversees compliance with the Canadian Council on Animal Care Framework. So he's got insight into how animal research regulation functions in practice. So all three of these wonderful panelists are members of the Animal Alliance Advisory Group on Humane Science. We are very grateful to have them and grateful to have you all with us on this presentation. So today's discussion, we will be going over a few things. We will stop throughout the presentation to ask the panelists questions. There will be a live Q&A portion at the end of the presentation. So you'll all see a Q&A box towards the bottom of your screen. You can submit your questions there as they arise, and we'll be sure to answer them at the end. Your questions are anonymous. So if you did want to say hello to any of the panelists, just let me know if you don't mind me reading that. Otherwise, you will remain anonymous. So today we'll be going over what Bill 75 proposes and how it relates to the Animals for Research Act. We'll be going over the proposed amendments to the Animals for Research Act and what that would mean for dogs and cats in practice, whether the changes that are being proposed close existing loopholes or if they leave key issues unresolved or up for interpretation, and how oversight and accountability and enforcement currently work here in Ontario, but we will broadly touch on Canada as well. We'll also be going over what comes next in the legislative and regulatory process and how everyone can remain engaged throughout the process. So Kira will be presenting information on the slides, and then we will stop on some of these slides to ask the panelists questions. So I'll let you take it away, Kira.
Thanks, Bianca. So to start, I'll just introduce the bill. So at the end of November, the Ontario government introduced Bill 75. Its official title is called the Keeping Criminals Behind Bars Act, and that's because the bill has several schedules that touch on various subject matters, but Schedule 1 of the bill is focused specifically on the Animals for Research Act, which is what we'll be discussing today. So at a very high level, and we'll get into the details throughout the presentation, but the bill aims to prohibit invasive medical research on cats and dogs, prohibit supply facilities from breeding cats or dogs for research. It sets out the roles and responsibilities of animal care committees in greater detail than it currently does in the current form of the Act, and it sets out the penalties associated with breaching the Act. At the same time, the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food, and Agribusiness put out a proposal which detailed both the prospective amendments to the Animals for Research Act and also its regulations. So on the slide are the 8 categories that this proposal set out. They're word for word on the slide, but just to provide a bit more context, I'll go through each one briefly. So the first one, it would include the definition of what invasive medical research means. So the regulations would define what counts as invasive medical research, including surgery, significant psychological impacts, serious pain or distress, or death, while generally excluding most behavioral and nutritional research. Second, the permitted types of invasive research. So there's an exception contemplated for invasive research, medical research on cats and dogs for veterinary purposes, such as advancing animal health, veterinary education, or regulated veterinary drug development, but only with a animal care committee approval, and it requires that alternatives were considered. And third, euthanasia is still part of the research protocol. So the proposal would prohibit research projects where it's an expected endpoint, but it would still allow euthanasia on a case-by-case basis for humane reasons. Fourth, the criteria for approved research projects. So the Animal Care Committee would face expanded written obligations, including assessing alternatives, justifying the number of animals used, reviewing the housing and enrichment situations where the animals are homed, considering rehoming them after the experiments are complete, and identifying humane intervention points. Fifth is about the record retention. So the Animal Care Committee records and assessments would have to be kept for 3 years after a project concludes. And then six is the transitional period. So existing research that doesn't comply with this new framework would have up to 1 year to wind down and transition. Seven is the humane euthanasia standards. They're quite vague in this proposal, but they say the regulations would update to reflect current best practices and remove outdated, no longer humane methods. And then eight is other changes, kind of a catch-all, primarily includes housekeeping amendments, so repealing obsolete provisions and updating sections that no longer reflect the research practices. So in conjunction, the bill and the proposal together would ban invasive research on cats and dogs, but allow some exceptions. It would ban breeding cats and dogs for research in Ontario. It would allow but not require adoption of animals after research use. And it would update how these internal committees approve and monitor research. So with that high-level summary, we'll now turn to our experts to elaborate further on a few of those points.
So this is a question for Angela or Vaughan. The ban invasive research on dogs and cats, but allowing exceptions. What could you explain what those exceptions would mean in practice for dogs and cats?
Can I just make a preliminary point and not speak at great length? I'll allow the bulk of this to go to Angela. But the question really invites us to look at the wording of Bill 75 and compare it with the existing statute. And I think we'll get to that. But I want to say more generally, we don't know very well and can't know very well what difference this will make in practice. And that's for the following reason. All these things are going to be administered by decision-making members on animal care committees, and those deliberations are secret, and we can't really get the results of what they decide and why they decided it. There's some very interesting research done by a woman named Catherine Shupley, who's now on the faculty at the University of British Columbia, where she interviewed members of animal care committees about their practice. She couldn't ask them about how they dealt with cases in the past, but she could ask them how they understood the standards that they were supposed to apply and their role. And she found out many interesting things, but the one of greatest interest to me, and I hope to you here, is that there was remarkable variety between an animal care committee at one university might have a very different understanding of what the rules were from another committee at the university down the street. And that may sound like just a standard feature of decision making. If you can imagine a situation in the criminal law where Parliament enacts a statute and one judge has a different understanding than the other. But it's different in this context, because in the legal context, if judges make a decision that people are unhappy with, somebody can appeal it. They can look at, when they get to the appeal level, decisions from other judges, and the appeal court sort it out and impose, or at least attempt to impose, a standard interpretation. And if there's differences among, say, between the Ontario Court of Appeal and the Nova Scotia Court of Appeal, it goes to the Supreme Court of Canada, and they sort it out. Nothing like that operates here. There's no effective means of appeal. The decisions that the ACCs make, and remember, Shupley looked at a lot of them and found it that they were all over the map. They disagreed with one another on what the standards meant. Those are not made public. They are shipped off to the ministry. The ministry doesn't make them public. People have tried to get access to that information through Freedom of Information Act, but they've been rebuffed. It doesn't work. So in short, we don't really have a very good idea what goes on at the ACC level, so the Animal Care Committee level. And that's not just today. If the bill was passed, Bill 75 passed, and you came back a decade from now and said, what difference did it make retrospectively? The answer, I think, would be the same. We don't really know. Now, that's not necessarily very helpful, so I think we can make our own stab at interpreting and trying to guess what differences they might make, but that's all got to be under the umbrella is we're guessing, and who knows, and we may never know. I'm going to turn it over to Angela at this point. But.
Yeah, Vaughan, yeah, I would definitely echo that, as a takeaway for people to understand is that we're still in the self-regulation universe. So, that has been ineffective for a lot of the reasons that Vaughan is highlighting, but it's still going to keep, that's still the basic premise. So that's important to keep in mind. But if we think about like the architecture of how this is supposed to work in terms of, okay, prohibiting invasive research, with the exception, and the big one to flag is the veterinary exception. So there would be, unless it's going to be furthering animal health, that one is potentially, quite wide, depending on like how you are going to interpret that. And as Vaughan flags, those will be the animal care committees that'll be interpreting it. So it's a bit difficult. And then there's another level with the invasiveness itself and how it's defined and cured, outline that really well. The thing that I would flag about it is that those are also incorporating sort of subjective determinations of what's considered significant or what's considered, not significant. And so, for instance, if you're an animal care committee and you're reviewing, are you going to be inclined to second guess a researcher's claim that this is actually causing minimal stress? So it's not reaching the bar of moderate stress, which is what's prohibited. Or even if you're talking about using a surgery or drug exposure, what's going to be significant short-term stress? Like they might say, well, actually it's short-term stress, but it's not that significant. Or also, they have to be able to regain normal functioning and not impair normal functioning for a significant period of time. So what would be considered a significant period of time? So you get the idea. You could run it through the details of what's being proposed specifically for the definition of invasive, but the general idea is it's going to be up to those animal care committees to be interpreting like what would be considered invasive and what wouldn't be. And then similarly with the veterinary exception, whether this is something that somehow goes either to the health, probably not of that particular animal, but maybe of that category of animals in general. And so there's just a lot of subjectivity here combined with like not really any oversight and certainly no public oversight.
Thank you both so much for that. Yeah.
Can I just add one small point here? I'll try to be quick. There's a second exception in the bill, namely one allowing the government to invoke new exceptions in addition to the veterinary exception, and to do so not by amending the statute, you wouldn't need that, but by regulation. Cabinet can decide it. There would be no debate, no committee of the legislature going on. It's interesting. The bill, the Animals for Research Act has been around for more than half a century. It hasn't been changed in any significant fashion. The Bill 75 is the first attempt to change it in any significant way. But there's been lots of changes to the regulations, as we might expect or hope. But the typical thought is with regulations, you do minor things within the existing scope of the statute, but you don't do anything really significant. The notion that Doug Ford and his cabinet could simply add a new exception in addition to the veterinary one without public debate, without going before the legislature, is, to my mind, well, it's typical of the greater centralization of government power that we in cabinets that we see in throughout the Western world and including federally. But to my mind, a change like this is really significant and shouldn't be brought about by regulation. And we'll just have to see whether there are additional regulations, but it really could completely override the so-called ban on invasive research without public debate.
Thank you, Vaughan and Angela. That was very insightful. I'll just move to the next point, banning breeding of dogs and cats for research in Ontario. So, Angela and Vaughan, this is a question for you again. If dogs and cats cannot be bred in Ontario for research, how might research facilities continue to obtain them?
Well, I mean, there's a few very well-known ways that this happens. So one really important one that I'm sure many people watching this are aware of is, the pound to lab pipeline. So, that's something that's not going to be touched by this because it's only for breeding. And then the other big one I would flag is procurement outside the province and also outside the country. So the dogs coming from the US, which is often what's happening. I didn't realize this until we prepped for this webinar, but there is no specific breeding facility in Ontario. So, Ontario's and facilities in Ontario are not getting their dogs. They're not breeding their own dogs. They're getting their dogs from other places. And so to ban the breeding is really, I don't know, it's very cynical in a way because it sounds like you're doing something significant, but are you really? Sometimes we call these paper tiger statutes. There are statutes that like they look like they have teeth, they look like they have bite, but that in reality they're just like as flimsy as a piece of paper. So I would say that the decision here to like limit things to just the breeding is really a very good example of that. I wish it wasn't.
Mm-hmm. You might even perversely suggest that Doug Ford's trying to fight the Ontario auto industry going off to the United States. Why doesn't he try to establish breeding in Ontario, which would number one have Ontario jobs, but more to the point, he could regulate it in Ontario. We don't know what the regulation and overall structure of the breeding facilities that we order from in Michigan. I mean, we can guess, but if Doug Ford really wanted to sort of oversee the matter, he could sort of facilitate breeding of, I'm not arguing for this, but facilitate breeding of dogs in Ontario and control it through tight regulation. But more generally, I agree with Angela. This isn't going to change the number of dogs that are bred for research. It's just going to mean they continue to be bred in Michigan and imported. It's not going to mean one less dog is bred for research than would be if we were breeding them in Ontario. It's just virtue signaling.
And Angela, you touched on it, but just for anyone that's attending or watching this that is unaware of the municipal pound shelter to lab pipeline, could you briefly touch on what that looks like currently?
Well, I don't I know about it in great detail, but my understanding is that that's where a lot of the dogs are coming from. It would also be connected to backyard breeding insofar as especially we saw a lot of this post-pandemic, people dumping and abandoning the dogs, and so those are the dogs that are going to end up in the pound system and in the shelter system, and so. I think there are some niceties around like Can they be purchased or can they not be purchased? I don't really know that super well, but I do know that this is a big issue, and it's one that I think probably many people who are watching the webinar in their own organizations and in their own work could bring a little bit more attention to this, that, that those dogs are dogs that, they were in somebody's house, and originally the movement to try to regulate at all animals being used in research historically it came from situations of dog nappings. In the US, there was like very famous example of Pepper, the Dalmatian dog, who and it made it on the cover of Life magazine and so on. And that really spurred changes in the US. In the US, they adopted the Animal Welfare Act, which required registrations and licenses. In Canada, we didn't really go that way. We went this sort of private self-regulation route. And so what that meant is that we just don't have as rigorous oversight. I'm not saying it's perfect in the US, but at least in the US, you're required to be licensed. And in Canada, Ontario is the only province that has an Animals for Research Act. Like we're complaining about the Ontario Act, the Animals for Research Act, but if you're in another province in Canada, it's even worse. Like your facilities are not even required to be registered and have a license and have animal care committees unless they're members of the Canadian Council for Animal Care, which I think Andrew's going to tell us more about. But yeah, so that's a real I think it's something that is not maybe widely known. And if people use their various platforms to make that more well known, I think that would really be quite powerful.
Yeah, we have some members from some pretty great dog rescues and organizations in Ontario with us today, so it's definitely good to know. To touch on that quickly before we go to a question for Andrew, Animal Alliance has been working on the No Pets in Research campaign for 30 plus years. One of the main call to actions for the campaign was actually to amend the Animals for Research Act to close that pound to research facility pipeline. And so as it stands, that hasn't been amended. And from what it sounds like today, that's not something that this bill or proposal touches on. But the currently any municipal shelter with contract or anyone that has the contract, a research facility could approach them and could obtain dogs or cats for research for less than $10. It depends on whether or not they're a dog or a cat. And then they could be funneled into the research system. So that's what it looks like now. It is something that's not talked about often. So there are resources for that and more information about that. So I'll be sure to share that in the post webinar resources as well because it's an important topic. So going on to the next question, Andrew, this question is for you. This next point about allowing but not requiring the adoptions of animals after research use. Currently, what happens to animals after their research purpose is complete?
So I'll just say I'll reiterate some of what Vaughan and Angela have already shared because this is an important caveat is that there's a great deal of a lack of transparency about how animals are used in science in Canada, and so this always has to be that caveat unless you're working in a lab, and I haven't. And unless you've, worked in multiple labs across the country and no one has worked in enough of them to make claims of deep knowledge here, I'm depending on folks that have been clear-eyed and honest about what's going on. So here are three, and I should add, I've been chair and co-chair of a subcommittee for the CCAC revising their ethics document. That should be out soon, I'm told. And so I do have a CCAC service connection, not speaking on behalf of them at all. But it isn't an experience with the animal care committees directly. So there's three possibilities for animals and this always has to be the caveat, who survive use in scientific activity. One is they can be relocated to another facility for further scientific use or reassigned within the facility they're in to another scientific activity. So that's one possibility. Second possibility is they're killed CCAC requires humane killing, but they will be killed. So that's the second possibility. And then the third possibility is they can be rehomed, or as these changes are saying in Ontario, adopted out. I'd want to make a distinction between those two in an important way. But rehoming is much rarer. It's much more common to either have them relocated to another facility for reuse, or reassigned for reuse, or killed. And Larry Carboni, he's retired now, but he was a lab veterinarian who's written a lot on animal bioethics, and he's a good source for this. So, from his perspective as a working laboratory veterinarian for a number of decades, most animals are killed. So that's what happens to most animals that are used in science. And so I think, and the rehoming. Here's a quote from the change in the regs for rehoming. This is the quote: "The research project proponent has demonstrated in writing consideration of whether the animals, dogs, cats, or other animals, can be rehomed, that is, adopted out safely and successfully upon completion of the research," unquote. Two things jump out. Rehoming is not the default expectation, and it's put in terms of adopting out, and both those are inadequate.
And so who decides if an animal is fit to be adopted?
That's going to be like it's likely to be, now again, lack of transparency here, this space we're working in. It's likely to be veterinarians. Now, if any of the audience is thinking, what's the quality of their ethics training here? Because Angela has already been hinting at some of the subjectivity here, but it's also important to think of ethics training. And here's part of the problem for veterinarians in the system. They're used to the diminishment of any kind of claim of respectful treatment, a concern for the welfare of these animals, and that they're treated fairly. And so within a frame where their ethics training includes what's been reinforced, it includes the compromises they've made in the space in which they work, where their commitment to the respectful treatment of these animals, a concern for their welfare and treating them fairly, has been diminished because of the nature of the work. You should be worried, if you're in the audience, about how that impacts how they make decisions about who is eligible for rehoming. And of course, part of the problem in Canada is if these animals have been modified, so say there's been some kind of genetic modification, they can't be adopted out. They're killed or reused before they're killed. And that's not good enough. This is why the adopting out is not good enough in these changes. We take a lot from these animals when we use them in science, and all of us that benefit from the scientific use incur a debt to these animals. So what I highlighted before about respect and concern, that those generate duties of care. In ethics, that's the language we use. When we take something away from an animal that we had no right to take from them, and that's here in this space, using them in science, we have no right to do this to animals, we just do it. Then we incur a debt for that use. This is a duty of repair. Now, one part of the problem here with this approach to rehoming is that duty of repair is not repaid by killing them, because by killing them, so we've used them in science and taken away something from them, something important. When you kill them, you then take away all they have and all they'll ever have. That's not a repayment of debt. That's avoiding it. And so rehoming has to be understood as more than adopting out. If there are welfare eligible animals who cannot find homes in Ontario or elsewhere in Canada, there should be society supported sanctuaries where the priority is their well-being until they live out the remainder of their life. It's the least we can do to repay an incurred debt and a duty of repair because of what we took from these animals. And the current changes show no real awareness of that. Even the duties of care is diminished, and diminished because of the setting we're talking about. But duties of repair are really important here, and they're not taken seriously enough in these proposed changes.
Thank you so much, Andrew. The next point on here that we will touch on in an upcoming slide is that there is if implemented together, the bill and proposal would update how internal committees approve and monitor research. Andrew's going to walk us through that in a few slides. So we'll come back to that one about kind of what the current oversight framework looks like and how that update may affect that. So Kira, I'll turn it back to you to take us through to the slides.
Thank you. So taking in everything we've just heard, what do these proposed amendments mean for cats and dogs? I'll just provide a brief summary. So it will provide potentially some protections, but several loopholes still remain. So including the exception for the veterinary purpose. This could include experimental drugs and new surgical techniques. It doesn't account for, we didn't touch on this one yet, but it doesn't account for non-medical forms of research. So that could be toxicity testing or chemicals or pesticides. The breeding prohibition, of course, only applies to Ontario facilities. And as we'll discuss next, and as we've heard already, the oversight remains self-policing as through these animal care committees. So turning more to looking at these animal care committees. So first, there's the Canadian Council on Animal Care, so the CCAC, which is a nonprofit primarily funded by the Canadian Institute of Health Research and the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council, as well as membership fees for the research facilities that participate. But research facilities that do not receive any public funding also do not have to participate in the CCAC process. So membership is voluntary for them. And then there's the animal care committees that you've heard about, which are the internal committees of the research institutions, typically comprised of institutional staff themselves, maybe sometimes outside members as well, but currently that's not required. So again, we'll turn to our experts if they would like to elaborate on any of this further.
Yeah, Andrew, specifically, if you can touch a little bit more on what this oversight system looks like, and given what we saw on the previous slide about there potentially being that update to how these internal committees operate, could you give us a brief overview of what is happening now and what that could look like with the bill and the regulatory changes?
Sure. I'll just add something to what Kira said, just to amplify some of Kira's points. And thank you, Kira, for all of the what you're doing here for the presentation. So for the Canadian Council on Animal Care, their funding, as Kira's mentioned, there's two federal agencies, funding agencies, NSERC, which has to do with natural sciences and engineering, and CHR, which is Canadian Institutes of Health Research. They're a significant funder. Now you got to be thinking, if you're in the audience, about conflicts of interest here, but they're a significant funder of the CCAC. But so are the program fees, and the reason why I'm bringing that up is that include that for those of you who are Canadian taxpayers or residents who are taxpayers, that's you. So the CHR and NSERC, their primary funding is from taxpayers' revenue, and the program participation fees. So these are public universities. Guess what? So you're actually indirectly funding that organization. And here's the kicker: it's not publicly accountable. It doesn't report to a federal minister. It doesn't report to a federal office. It doesn't report to a federal department. It is publicly unaccountable and yet relies largely on your indirect funding through your tax dollars. And I think that's unacceptable. So that's just a caveat to add to what Kira said. I don't think that's acceptable. That has to change. They have to be made publicly accountable. So let's switch now to the oversight. I can speak to, again, always the caveat of secrecy. So I'll give you a rundown of, I can't give you a rundown of what happens in Ontario under the statute, but I can give you a rundown of what happens with animal care committees. Angela and Vaughan have already hinted at this, particularly Angela. So it is important to see that this is self-regulation. These are typically autonomous bodies, these animal care committees. That's really important as well. These changes that Ontario is suggesting is trying to actually have a repository of records, as has been mentioned by Kira, but it's not adequate because it's only for a few years. They're not pooled. They're not publicly available, so we can cut down on duplication. Here's why that's important. Duplication is unnecessary. Science runs on replication, not duplication. So anytime you have duplication and you're using animals in a way that's harmful, that's unnecessary use. It cannot be ethical. And so there's a problem here. And it's a problem that this government, that is the Ontario government, can fix, but they need a will to do it. And now these committees are made up, and it depends on the jurisdiction. It depends on the institution. But these committees can be made up of professional peers of the scientists that are submitting their proposals. These peers can be peers that themselves have experience using animals in science, conflicts of interest, and professional peers that haven't. Now, if we're going to actually have a well-populated animal care committee, it should also include members of the public who have no connection with the relevant institution. And it should, I think, have ethicists or someone trained in ethics and advocates from animal advocacy organizations. You see this in other parts of the world. Now, in the CCAC, what they do is they certify the institutions, as Kira said. This happens first with a visit where they actually talk with the institution and ensure the institution meets some kind of minimal standards that they have for their facilities and infrastructure, and then they will periodically visit to make sure that those are up to par. They're required to have animal care committees. These are the institutions that are certified. Those animal care committees are again autonomous. The CCAC doesn't make decisions or approval decisions or rejection decisions on proposed animal use. Those are the animal care committees, again, autonomous. They report annually their use of the animals. The visits that the CCAC will do for CCAC accredited institutions are announced ahead of time. They don't just show up. They announce ahead of time, and that's suboptimal. A change in the Ontario regs allows for unannounced visits. That's much, much better. But in the change regs for what's going on in Ontario, here's a quote from the relevant statute on the animal care committees. You have a specific mention of veterinarians and then quote such members as may be required by regulations or meet such criteria as may be set out in the regulations. That's not good enough. If they want to actually take this seriously, and again, they have to, the membership matters. At the minute, they tend to be weighted heavily in favor of animal scientists, that is, scientists that have used animals. That's not acceptable because buried in that, though free for all of you to see, is a deep conflict of interest, and that has to be corrected. Now, Bianca has mentioned there's, be changes in the emphasis of what happens internally to these committees. Always remember what Vaughan has said. We will never know how well this is implemented because we don't have access to it. One of the things that is strongly emphasized is the 3 R's. So replacement, reduction, and refinement. Replacement has to do with replacing sentient animals. Reduction, reducing their numbers of used. Refinement, it means actually trying to avoid, minimize, or eliminate scientifically unnecessary stress and distress. The scientifically necessary stuff, the 3 R's will give that a pass. Here's a kicker about the 3 R's. It originates in William Russell and Rex Bursa's 1959 book, The Principles of Humane Experimental Technique. They never intended this to be ethics. They are explicit about this in their book. They're not doing ethics. And it's for a good reason. The 3 R's can't be adequate ethics constraints. They cannot ask legitimate ethics questions like, is harmful animal research ethically acceptable? Is it ethically acceptable if it uses non-human primates, cats, or dogs, or anyone else? Is it ethically acceptable if this harmful research borders on or exceeds what a conscious animal can bear? Those are category E studies, if you wanted to know. And should welfare eligible animals be rehomed after scientific use? The 3 R's cannot raise those questions, logically can't, and cannot adequately answer them. The 3 R's were never intended to get in the way of science. They were intended by Russell and Birch to reduce noise, to improve the quality of the science using animals. It's not about ethics. If you want to have ethics, you're talking about things like respect. You're talking about concern for welfare. You're talking about fair treatment. You're talking about making sure that there is sufficient benefit from these animals used. There is no mention in these changed statutes the best interests of a cat or dog's welfare. No mention of that at all. That's important because in the regulations, and I quote, there is a recognition when using cats or dogs in stuff that would be compatible with the changes. Quote, where a severe impact, including severe pain, as part of the research model without analgesia or anesthesia is expected or reasonably likely to occur. That can happen with cats and dogs with these changes. And there's no reference to the best interests of their welfare. That is language that's in federal statutes, albeit about captive cetaceans. So we have the precedent in law to have that language. If you do not have that language here, these animals, even for veterinary purposes, or what is judged to be primarily on balance, veterinary purposes, can actually face a great deal of profound and serious harm, and they will not be adequately protected here with the changes that are going on. And so I think that needs to be the euthanasia stuff as well. Euthanasia stuff's the wrong language. We should be talking about killing. Kira already mentioned the definition of invasive research includes death. So research is dangerous. If we knew what was going to happen, it wouldn't be research. Research is risky. And so we need to actually have on our radar killing. Not euthanasia is about humane killing, but killing that can happen in research. We need to have that clearly in our sights. Here's a little bit more of the quote about invasive research that Kira mentioned in the rags. Here's quotes. Alteration of the animal's physical integrity, including through surgery. Significant impacts to the animal's physiological systems, including as a result of exposure to drugs or chemicals that would be expected to impair normal function. Moderate to severe pain, extreme stress, a significant level of stress, or death. And so these need to be corrected. It is important to have language in there about in the best interests of a cat or dog's welfare. Folks have been talking. I've heard folks talk online about this is the end of dog and cat testing. It is not. Here's a quote from the regs. So, dog and cat testing includes for, quote, regulatory approval of new veterinary drugs or pest control products intended for animal use, unquote. That follows in the regs under the title, proposed types of research or purposes of research for which invasive medical research may be performed in relation to a cat or a dog. So it's not banning animal testing. It's not banning testing on dogs and cats. And I think animal advocacy groups that are trying to see this needle move rightly should stop saying that. It's deeply misleading and it gets in the way. I'm not accusing anyone in Animal Alliance doing that, but I've seen it in social media from other animal advocacy groups, and it's misleading. Testing will continue.
Thank
I
you.
hope that.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Andrew. Um, Thank you. That was very thorough. There's some really great questions coming into the Q&A as well. I'll let Kira take it away and explain kind of what comes next in this process, and then we'll go over some just quick ways that you can stay involved, and then we'll start with the Q&A.
Thank you. Yes, I'll try and keep this brief so we have lots of time for all these great questions coming in. So what comes next? So right now, Bill 75, with any bill, there's going to be 3 readings, and there's potentially between readings, second and third reading is a committee phase. So Bill 75 is in second reading. The debates had started before the winter break, and they will be resuming in as early as March, should they choose to start with this bill at the end of March. So there's 2 kind of outcomes here. Assuming it moves forward, it's whether or not the committee phase happens. So we've seen this government move bills without a committee hearing before. But what we are really hoping is that it does go to committee, because this gives us a chance to, for public hearings, written submissions, stakeholder input. They'll go clause by clause review, and this is the most likely phase where amendments could happen, and then would be voted on and potentially incorporated. So the alternative would be if the bill bypasses committee, it would move quickly to third reading. And in this scenario, there's little to no opportunity for public input. The amendments are quite unlikely, and this bill could pass rapidly in its current state. And at the same time, the OMAFRA proposal that we mentioned that has already gone through some written consultation from the public. So that would follow, if the bill is passed, the regulations would follow, probably without any further public input at this point. So in essence, we're at a very pivotal moment. Legislative debate is still going on, which means advocacy and scrutiny now can really still influence the outcome. So yes, they were on winter break, but they are still working. It's a good time to get the attention of MPs. Maybe I'll switch to the next slide now, how you can get engaged. But if you're an Ontario resident, a really great way is to contact your MPP to discuss the bill, express your concerns. As I was saying, it's a good time to get their attention before they go back to debate, get in their head. And so you can do this through a quick action if you're low on time is through our form letter on Animal Alliance's campaign page. But even better is to try and set up a meeting with your MPP, write a handwritten letter or mail a letter, something in your own words can go a lot further. And then we also encourage you to stay up to date on where the campaign is at or where the bill is at. So you can do that by signing up for Animal Alliance's newsletter, or also signing up for the Brooks Animal Law Digest, which, as Bianca mentioned at the beginning, it's a great free resource, provides biweekly animal law policy and advocacy updates in very plain and easy to digest language. And Professor Fernandez oversees the digest at the U of T's animal law program. So I will just flip the slide as well to give you a chance to write down any of our contact information if you'd like, as we are about to transition into the question period. Before we do that, I just wanted to give the experts a chance if they had any pressing thoughts that hadn't been addressed yet. If you want to briefly touch on those, you could feel free to chime in now.
Just one thing to mention to folks, because I've seen this in media pieces, and this is not blaming journalists for this. I know the kinds of pressure under. I have a couple of friends who are journalists. But one of the things to watch out for you in the audience are bioethicists who will call into question this effort to move the needle on dogs and cats, because what's special about dogs and cats? Why not all of them? Every single social reform movement in the history of humanity has had to choose its battles. Every single one. You can't do it all. And so when you get to choose a needle move, you move the needle. And watch out for bioethicists that will criticize that and end up trying to defend the status quo. I've seen it in the media. I've seen it from a Canadian bioethicist. You know who you are, and it needs to stop because it's dishonest. When you get a chance to move a needle, you move the needle. It's all about you fight your battles where they are. You don't lose sight of the greater battle of actually making a big difference for all sentient beings. But you know the history of this, and so stop saying that, and then stop saying it as if it's massively important and then defending the status quo. And when you hear bioethicists do that, call them out on it.
Maybe just to build on that in relation to one of these questions. So one of the questions is, what are the other prescribed animals in the amendments? So just to give everyone some context, the language currently relates to cats, dogs, and other prescribed animals in the bill. And right now there are no other prescribed animals or any potentially animals being considered, but that's good language to have, as it will let us potentially move the needle further for other species in the future. It'll be easier to add them to this legislation through the regulations rather than through the full consultation process of the legislature. Bianca, do you want to transition into other questions?
Yeah, I just wanted to actually read. There was a question that came up, Andrew, while you were on the oversight uh, portion, and somebody had asked if what can we do, like if if they're not publicly accountable, but they're publicly funded, how could they be made publicly accountable? Legislation? That's with legislation, or how would that work? And that's the CCAC.
It's a great question. So I've been writing about this to some MPs in Parliament. That includes Elizabeth May and Nathaniel Erskine-Smith. I don't think it's going to be a secret that they're both sympathetic to this, would like to see this happen. Write to your favorite parliamentarian, write to your representative. This has to change, and it'll have to be a decision of government. And so make it a decision of government that if they're going to receive taxpayers' money, they should be publicly accountable for how they spend it. Because right now, their best public accountability is when they'll release their guidelines for public feedback, and that's not good enough. That's not public accountability because you have no control over how they then decide on that public feedback and what it means. There's a new ethics document that's going to be coming out. Their last ethics document hasn't been revised since 1989, and it wasn't an ethics document because there was no clear ethics principles in that document. And so we have one coming, but no one gets to hold them publicly accountable for either the compromises they made in that document to get it through or its enforcement. And so write to your favorite parliamentarians, write to Elizabeth May, show your support for this effort, write to Nathaniel Erskine Smith, even if you're not in their jurisdiction, and show your support for that effort and beg them to make this a talking point in the House of Commons.
Great, thank you so much. There's another question here that says, what can we do as members of the public to try to ensure a committee reading so that we can have public input? I just wanted to say quickly before I pass this on to the panelists, I did put a link in the chat that everyone should be able to see. That is actually links to our campaign page where we have a form that's hosted through something called New Mode. So in You'll see that it's pre-populated we wrote that at Animal Alliance of Canada. So you'll see that the email itself is pre-populated. You can edit it and add your own comment. A copy of that goes to the Premier of Ontario. A copy goes to the Ministry of Agriculture. And then they'll also, it'll CC your representative, your MPP, based on where you're located when you put in your postal code. And so everyone will get a copy. And to be clear, that's not for the CCAC. It pertains to Bill 75 and the proposed regulations. That is available so that the more emails go into those offices and the wording is consistent and we're asking the same thing, that's really helpful. But I'll let the panelists add to that as well.
If I could just make one comment on the question of what we do to see that it gets before the committee. I'm a little bit cynical about the fact that this Bill 75 is an omnibus bill, as Kira talked about. It's the Keeping Criminals Behind Bars Act. It's got bail reform. It's got a bunch of things. Cynical I am because I think government often buries things in omnibus bills that doesn't want to have a lot of discussion of. So even this goes to committee, the committee can choose to spend its entire time on the bail reform issue or on one of the other 6 or 7 statutes that's being amended. So it's not an answer to the question. It's a two-part. One, it goes to the committee, but the committee's only got 3 days of hearings and devotes none of it to reform of the Animals for Research Act. I don't know what can be done about that, other than to suggest that it's really pre-planned to put it in an omnibus bill to minimize the opportunity for public discussion.
Thank you, Vaughan. There's a question here that says, my question is, was St. Joseph's Lawson Research Healthcare, London, Ontario, supplying dogs from the 6th floor for testing at London Health Sciences Foundation? Has this practice ceased? I don't know if we'll know the specifics of this, but has the practice of the testing that was done at St. Joseph's in London, has that ceased? I believe that specific, I can't say for certain. I might not be the best person to answer. Kira, do you know if that's if they stopped that research?
Yeah, I mean, I think as far as the media's reported, that specific practice has ended with the dogs, and they've allegedly released most of them, if not all of them at this point. I think there might be two left, um, somewhere, not to the Beagle Alliance, which had offered to take them, but somewhere that where they could still be kind of secret as to what happened. And then just quickly for anyone who doesn't know the background of this, I think a lot of our audience probably does, but this was what happened in the summer in London, Ontario, where the whistleblower came forward and exposed that these procedures were happening to dogs. They were being exposed to like 3 hour long heart attacks, and they were ultimately discarded. They were chopped up and put in barrels in the freezer and done with. So it was pretty awful. The whistleblower, as well as Animal Justice and the U of T's investigative IJB. Angela, you can probably correct me on that. But they did a great article in the National Post that managed to get a lot of attention and get the practice stopped. And it has also continued the discussion to allow this bill to be. And I also just quickly want to say, while I have the floor here, that I don't want to leave everyone kind of depressed here. This is still great that we have these conversations happening. As Vaughan mentioned, like this Animals Research Act hasn't been touched in years. So it is still a positive step forward, a little move in the needle if it does get through in its current state, but it does, as we clearly demonstrated, have a long way to go to get it to where we would like it to be.
Yeah.
And
Oh, I just was going to jump in, Kira, to add about the IGB. I'm glad you gave them a shout out, the Investigative Journalism Bureau at the Dalai Lama School for Public Health at U of T, because, not only did they help Animal Justice with breaking that London dog story, they also broke the story about Neurotechnics, which is a Scarborough lab using dogs from a lab in Wisconsin, Ridgeland, that has had basically had to shut down because of the practices that were revealed there that they were doing on their dogs. And, the fact that this Ontario lab was getting the dogs from Wisconsin, it shows you that this is sort of how this is how that market and the practice works. So the banning of the breeding just inside the province is it's not going to stop that kind of procurement of animals. But anyway, I just wanted to also just give the IJB a shout out for that as well.
And just while we're talking about these instances, another question we had and preparing for this panel, we had some internal debates on was whether or not this legislation would actually stop those types of tests, like the London Dog Hospital test. So, Angela or Vaughan, if you want to give your perspectives on that, that'd be great.
I leave it to Angela.
Well, it seems like, when you read the regs, they really are talking like almost referring directly to the London dog incident. So, they start off by saying the proposed amendments refer to recent public attention surrounding the use of cats and dogs in research, which has raised public interest. So, you don't have to like read between the lines too much to know like this is what they're talking about. They say the legislation has not been updated for some time. The current ARA framework may be perceived as not having the right level of protections for animals being used in research and which ones for which research and so on. So, that whole statement itself could be unpacked to say, okay, well, what are they caring about? They're caring about the perception. The reality, like, would these new regulations actually prevent what happened from happening? Um, you know, it's really hard to say because, possibly they may have cabined it under the veterinary exception, or they might have said that the harm that they were doing was not moderate to severe, it was minimal, or we don't really know. And this just sort of goes back to the problem that we've been talking about, is that the Animal Care Committee, if they feel satisfied by, what the researcher has said, and they kind of routinely are okay in cat and dog research experimentation, they've been desensitized to the ethics of it, as Andrew explained, then, there's a lot of room for interpretation there. And so I don't think, I don't know how Andrew and Vaughan feel about it, but I don't know that we can confidently say what happened in London would not now be able to happen under this new framework.
I can jump in as well, just to amplify some of what you said, Angela, and I agree. There's a lot of worries here. So here's the language from the regs. It can happen in a veterinary facility, but here's the other one, because there's an or, that the research is on balance primarily intended and in veterinary staff. And so that's very, very permissive language, and that's a worry. Now think of the LRI incident with the cardiac dogs, or the cardiac study with the dogs. Here's one of my worries. That animal care committee that approved that is still an animal care committee that's working, and that animal care committee failed those dogs, failed them. The CCAC has failed those dogs. Think of that contract research facility in Scarborough, the one that's just been talked about. The CCIC failed those animals because that's a certified institution under review now. But what the heck were they thinking? How did this actually go on for so long? That's a failure at the CCAC. And so those are things to track here. And really important to front and center here. The dog cardiac studies here was some of the worries I had, just as someone who does philosophy, bioethics, philosophy of mind, but no folks that work in philosophy of science. Those dogs that were used in that cardiac study, these were young dogs. First off, young dogs. The heart attacks were induced. These were healthy dogs. Cardiac disease is a whole body problem. Those animals being used as models for humans were healthy going in, and apart from the damage that was done to their hearts, they were healthy animals apart from that. That's not a valid model of human heart disease. And yet the Animal Care Committee approved that. So whatever they're doing, they are not thinking deeply about valid animal models. That Animal Care Committee is still around. They'll still be making decisions under these changes. There needs to be a deeper discussion and a way to hold animal care committees accountable for decisions that are lazy or don't reflect a thought about things like validity of animal models. It's a complicated space. We don't have to get into it here, but it is important to note those dogs were young. I hope I don't have to tell you, folks with heart disease, I've had them in my family. They're not young people. And two, they were healthy. That's not the case of my family members with heart disease. And that's a whole body problem. So those models, not remotely valid. What was the Animal Care Committee thinking? I don't think they were thinking well at all.
Andrew, while on this point, do you have any insight on what might prompt the CCAC to put a research facility on probation?
Oh, again, this is the transparency issues going back to Vaughan. There is a transparency initiative now at the CCAC where they're going to try and do better. And that includes reporting now what kind of status an institution has. So are they on probation? Are they interim? It's already appearing on their website. They will, hopefully by 2028, be compiling recommendations that are recurring. And what they're recommending, this is beginning to resemble more of what you see in the United Kingdom through their Home Office. It'll still be not as transparent as it should be, because we'll still not know about these protocols. We'll still not know about what these animal care committees are deciding. And it's really, really important that they all work together to both hold each other accountable. Because as Vaughan said, these decisions happen all over the place. That shouldn't be happening in a reflective space, but it's happening in a reflective space because these are autonomous bodies. They should be talking to each other and talking to each other and keeping records permanently, not for 3 years, allows us to avoid duplication. Because again, duplication is unnecessary scientific use. It cannot be ethical when you're causing animals serious harm. It cannot be. I don't care if they're cats, dogs, or budgies. If it's a duplication, that's not necessary scientific use. And so this is the sort of stuff that should be on people's radars. We need to have folks publicly accountable. It needs to be more transparent. These committees need not to be so autonomous. These decisions need to be collated. They need to be talking to each other. We need to see that they're talking to each other. We need to see the kinds of decisions they're making. And we need to see a real concerted effort to, one, take validity seriously. Are these good models? And two, stop approving duplicative use of animals in science, because that's immoral.
And just on that point, in relation to the transparency, so these, just so everyone knows, the CCAC is not accountable to freedom of information requests the way that other ministries federally are, because again, they are a nonprofit. Uh, so that's another issue with this legislation too, and this setup is we need to be able to compel them to tell us what's going on, and we currently can't.
Mhm. If I can just make a final comment, growing out of the London situation, this is going to strike some people as a little bit off the wall, but one thing that people should appreciate about the legal background is if you're a registered research facility doing approved research under the Animals for Research Act in Ontario, you're immune from prosecutions under the Provincial Animal Welfare Act, and that's part of the deal. That you've got a provincial statute that says it's an offense to create distress to animals. That doesn't apply to people who are registered facilities under the Act. But what isn't subject to immunity is criminal code prosecution for animal abuse. There's never been a Crown prosecutor in Canada who's charged basically a scientist for doing research, saying that that amounts to animal cruelty. But there's nothing in the statute, nothing in the Ontario statute that renders these people immune from that. I don't think that's about to change, but it would be nice to imagine there'd be a Crown prosecutor somewhere with the guts to say, I don't care that this was approved under the Ontario statute by a research committee. That's animal cruelty under the criminal code, and you're being prosecuted and you might go to jail, because at least some of the instances, maybe the London isn't the best example, strike me as simply being textbook examples of animal cruelty under the criminal code. But we haven't had Crown prosecutors who've taken that view. Basically, if you're wearing a white coat and you're in a lab, you're not subject to the criminal law of Canada. Sorry for that. So
Yeah, well, and
I
it's
hope that was
interesting.
sufficiently off the wall, but
No, I don't think
that's
it
my
is,
take on it.
but one thing that might be worth mentioning here too is also the Ridgeland Farms, the which had this Canadian connection through Neurotechnic. Those guys, the prosecutions, like the reason that there was effective pressure there was because a special prosecutor was appointed to really say, like, in exchange for not prosecuting you for these felony animal cruelty convictions, and some of them are more substantiated than others. In the end, they went with the ones that are called red eye experiments, where they do like awful things to the dog's eyes. But basically, that was the pressure. And then in the end, it wasn't a conviction, but it was a concession that they stop their breeding and they lose their Animal Welfare Act license. And so that's a good example where, like somebody did have the guts to step forward, and then the guts, it didn't result in anyone going to jail or the actual felony conviction, but it was a very good outcome in the sense of, shutting this place down in terms of what it was doing, and it's one of the largest dog breeding facilities in the U.S. So it's a very, very significant achievement.
There was a question that I think any of the panelists could jump in and answer this one. Are there any jurisdictions whose animal welfare laws you would point to as models for Ontario or Canada, and who they are and how we could better learn from them?
Well, I guess because I'm sitting in the UK, maybe I should start by jumping off by just saying I think the UK has probably always been, a bit better than Canada at responding to this problem. And they were reacting to the exact same kind of context in the 1960s as the US was and then Canada was. And I think the UK has done a lot better with it. And what I understand is that they have a kind of three-level licensing system, which is not just the facility, but also the researcher and the project as well. And so, that would be a model that we could certainly turn to quite readily. I'll let others comment. They probably know a bit more about it than me.
Can I just jump in there to amplify Angela again? Because that's a great point. A lovely point about both. And also, I think the first statute in the UK involving animals and science was 1876, something like that. I'm not a
Yeah.
something.
Yep.
And so they're old players in this game. And so they're the folks that we should be looking to as in some ways models, and in some ways we can still do better than what's happening in the United Kingdom. I speak as someone who grew up in Northern Ireland, so
Mhm.
but the tripartite licensing or permission stuff is really important. So in Canada, all that the CCAC has as an option, if you want to think about them, is the nuclear option. That is, you can take away the eligibility status of the relevant institutions that are certified. And if it's a university like I'm at, that punishes everybody for the misconduct of a team or a scientist. And that's not fair. And so it almost never happens because it wouldn't be fair. Whereas in the tripartite licensing or permissions, you have a certification of the institution, you have a licensing of the individual scientists, and then you have a licensing of the proposed project. And so that allows you a very precise sanction against misconduct because now you're no longer having to target the institution. You can target individual scientists. And that's what we should have in Canada is some kind of tripartite layer. And the CCAC should be operating under that as well so that they can sanction. Because, of course, the nuclear option gives them the excuse that they can't because it wouldn't be fair. If they changed it to a tripartite system, they could, and then we could try and hold them more accountable for not getting off their butt and sanctioning misconduct. And so I agree with Angela. I think we need to go to a tripartite level of licensing or permissions.
And just briefly, well, we're on the UK example, one example of a way in which they're superior to Canada, and goes back to my original intervention about the lack of transparency and you can't find out what's going on. In the UK, they publish annually, the relevant department does, a summary of all the approved research protocols. Now, the reason that you can't get access to them, the reason it's been offered in Canada is, well, if we told you what scientist was working on that, that person might be subject to, animal terrorists who would go and, send them a mail bomb or flashes or her tires or whatever. The UK just anonymizes it. It's not, you don't have to go to freedom of information request. It's just published automatically in little paragraph long things that anonymize things. Don't tell you what, whether it was at this university or that hospital, but simply say, the following protocol was approved to use 300 rats in a study that involved such and such, trying to prove such and such a hypothesis. All the rats were killed, and it's only 5 or 6 sentences per thing, but you can find out what the animals were, how many were dogs and cats, what they were being tested for, and find the website. You can go online and find it. So that it's not as detailed as you might like, but it gets around the excuse that's been offered by the Ontario courts for why we can't get public information. Oh, well, the animal terrorists would go and terrorize the relevant scientists. There's other ways the UK is better, but there's one.
We are just getting to time. There was one question that was coming up a lot, so I do just want to touch on it so it doesn't go completely unanswered. And please feel free to reach out to us directly with the contact information, contact@animalalliance.ca. But the question and comment that has been coming up a lot is questions about which shelters are supplying dogs to research facilities and if we know who they are. So I just wanted to say it. One of the questions was it municipal shelters, SPCAs? So we have more information on our website. It is municipal shelters that hold the contracts, but it is really important to say that we've worked with a lot of wonderful shelters in Ontario. It's not necessarily the shelters. It's not the shelter's fault. In Ontario's Animals for Research Act, as it stands, they're required, if a research facility approaches them, they are required to sell the animals for research. Are there shelters that don't because they don't want to comply with that? There could be, but that's the Ontario Animals for Research Act. So it's very much just wanted to point out that the shelters themselves, again, we've worked with a lot of wonderful animal shelters. There's a larger problem with overpopulation in Ontario shelters and that. So it's really important to keep all of that in mind. And one thing that the Animal Alliance of Canada has already started doing is putting together a rescue network, just gathering those rescues, their names and their whether or not they wanted to participate, and then going through a screening process with these rescues to see if they wanted to be on side and available if everything gets pushed through the bill and the regulatory proposal. If animals do start getting released from labs in large quantities, us just being ready and available to be able to assist. Again, we're not sure what that will look like. We're not sure how they plan to contact facilities, rescue facilities and groups to adopt out these dogs. As Andrew had mentioned earlier, that the term is vague, but we are starting to get prepared and to get ready. But you can email us for more information about the shelter to lab pipeline. We have a lot of resources and information again that will be going out via email to everyone. So if you have questions, you could always ask us or call the office as well. So I'll just turn it over to Kira if there's any last comments, or any of the panelists if you have anything else to say before we wrap up the webinar.
Just want to say thank you to the panelists for your time and your expertise. It was great having you here, and we loved hearing your insight.
And can I thank Animal Alliance for putting this together, and also for the folks that have come. Like, thanks for attending, and thanks for caring.
And with that, I think we're done. Thanks, everyone.